Morning, everybody.
Hello.
Morning. I suspect attendance may be a little late today. Although 12 already. What's that?
Is it because of the 8 a.m. meeting?
No, just because it's getting later in December. Seems like the later it gets.
Yeah. Thankfully, today is the last one.
Hey, John, just real quick, you might want to update your meeting every Wednesday at 9 p.m. the time in your agenda.
That meeting has been due. Oh, in the agenda it says that.
Yeah, it kind of throws people off.
That's going to be, well, actually I shouldn't, because I think we're going to switch. I'll add that.
Oh, okay. All right.
In fact, yeah, we'll give it another minute and then we'll get started. Let's see. Well, all right, not bad attendance. All right. All right, let's we'll give it 15 more seconds till 8:03 and we'll get started. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining Nephio's SIG Automation call for Wednesday, December 14th. Let me display. So basically, two agenda items.
John, you went on mute, I think.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me? Yeah, I don't know why they think sharing a tab means you want to share the audio. Okay. So I was saying the first item should be quick, updated meeting time. I can show you the survey results. So we had, let's see, how do I? All right, here we go. So it looks like you can see everything on one screen. 8 a.m. the time we were meeting. 25% of the people cannot meet then. It looks like actually 8:30 is the best time. It's not as convenient from, there's a number of people it's not as convenient for. So I don't know, we could do 9. Definitely either 8 or 9 have the most where people can meet regularly without inconvenience. But there's one person who can't meet regularly at this time. I have no idea who it is. But I don't know, any thoughts, or should we just decide this seems to be more convenient for more people, even if there's one person that can't always make it. This is the problem with providing too many options. I can't see people's faces. Any thoughts with going with 9 a.m. Even though there's one person it can't make it, it's more convenient for most people. Any major objections?
I think
Going
the
on.
needs of the
George.
many out. Sorry. I think the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Okay. Yep. All right. So then I'll ask Lucy to schedule the meetings in 2023 to start at 9 a.m. And then when we switch time zones again, hopefully our daylight savings times, we'll have her reschedule them so that they stay at 9 a.m. instead of the craziness that happened last year. Okay, that's all. Thank you. And then I'll actually turn it over to Wim. You had called for agenda items. I don't know if anybody is ready to present that, but
Yes, is anyone having a proposal that we want to discuss, or?
I can, I have
Yeah.
something. I'm Sandeep.
Okay. I would, yeah, my idea was first come, first serve. And we should, I don't know, I think Tal had also a proposal, I think he wanted to repeat. And there was one more person, I think, or not Tal, did I? got it
Sure,
wrong?
I've been a bit half functional. I've been sick, so I haven't really
Okay.
elaborated on it. But I can very briefly, in 2 minutes, show what I've already done, just give an idea of a direction, possibly.
Yeah, okay.
yeah, and I have what I would call a framework, which I think I've already said before, but that I think allows us to have everybody's things work. But we'll go through them one at a time.
Yeah, and I also have something that's like not in a proposal state, let's say like this, but some remarks or some thoughts that already went into this. So
Yeah, and I have also one slide, but it's also not concrete or something, but it's also, but yeah, I have one slide that I can present if you want. But I think let's start with Sandeep, right? And then, is that okay?
Okay. So should I start?
Yeah.
Is my screen, I think it is visible.
Yep.
So I have created a document, outlined the requirements from the infrastructure provisioning point of view. And so the context is basically defining the requirements and then designing the CRDs for infrastructure provisioning, and then designing the CRDs for another controller, which is the cluster prep dependency controller. So this is the intent of this document. So to give you the, a slight recap. So I had done this demo some time back in which I used the same Nephew POC controller in order to provision the EKS cluster on AWS. And what was used was Crossplane, and it was a KPT package with Crossplane KRMs defining the package, and using the same package deployment CR. I showed the intent specification for the cluster provisioning. So, and then there were review comments. So this document basically addresses those review comments, and basically defines the requirements and how we can go about these requirements and solve this. So the first part is the infrastructure provisioning itself. So for infrastructure provisioning, the requirement is basically we can have a Nephew infrastructure management cluster, and that cluster can have the components like it could be Crossplane, and underneath Crossplane, it could be basically CRDs from AWS, GCP, Azure, any all the cloud providers. or it could be multiple management clusters, one per cloud provider. So we have to see. And then the cluster should have config sync, porch, and the controller itself, which will which will basically address this intent, the workload intent. And for that, it can be the same NFO POC controller that we can leverage. And then the source repo where we put the KPT packages, and porch, which will curate these packages, make modifications and push it to the downstream package. So all this was demonstrated, and very simple CR was created, and all the CR that it had was the source repo name and the version, etc. So the requirement is to define a new CR. So maybe we can call it the infra deployment CR. And this CRD will, the spec will enable the users to specify the infrastructure intent. There is a hand already.
Yeah, you can continue. That's fine. We can wait till you get through this section.
Okay. So the spec, I mean, using this spec, the user can specify the properties of the cluster, which is the maybe the size of cluster, Kubernetes version, region, etc. And then these clusters are meant to deploy certain kind of services. We might as well come up with a service profile definition. For example, we can create a service profile for GNB, and that service profile will basically define the kind of packages that are required in order to deploy the CUDU, right? And that can be part of the intent. And then the question is about the fan out. So I will share this document, and we can, I mean, have these discussions offline as well. So fan out, I was not very, I'm thinking, but I'm not very clear on how this will fan out, because there is this one cluster, which is the management cluster, and that has the controller, and every cluster has a corresponding repo. So this cluster's corresponding repo will have all the KPT packages of the infra. Now, if the requirement is to create 100 clusters, the controller can create downstream packages in the same repo with modifications as per the intent. But then if config sync syncs those packages, I mean, will crossplane be able to handle these many parallel provisions? Because I used crossplane, or if we are using any other other provisioning mechanism. So we have to see how the fan out will work. So this part is about creating the cluster itself, provisioning the cluster. But just provisioning the cluster is not enough, because we have to prepare those clusters for workload orchestration. So the requirement for those, for that, the requirements are basically, first of all, we have to wait. This whole process is automated. So we have to wait for the cluster to be provisioned, come to a ready state. And then we have to, and I'm assuming that there is access to the cluster. And we have to do bare minimal preparation. And that is, the first thing is to prepare kube config. Have the secret prepare kube config for this cluster. And then at the minimum, deploy config sync in the target cluster and configure the config sync to its corresponding Git repo. I think only this part will require direct access to the cluster. Beyond this, everything can be through config sync and porch. And then based on the service profile, like I had defined, right? If we define a service profile, and then the controller can have enough intelligence to push the component related packages to the cluster's corresponding repo with modifications, of course. The examples that I have taken here are NFD, node feature discovery, Multus, the CNIs, and then it will push these to the controller should push these packages to the corresponding repo, and then let config sync it, and that way the cluster is prepared for the workload infrastructure. And of course, and after that, deploy Prometheus as well. So Prometheus for creating the metric pipeline with minimal configuration, at least to scrape the container level and node level metrics. And Yeah, so this was demonstrated, and the solution was, I mean, while we wait for the cluster to come up, we can watch the cloud provider's Kubernetes object itself. So Crossplane created a Kubernetes object, and eventually that comes up to the ready state. So the controller can watch that and wait for it to come to ready state, and then get the secret of this cluster, create kube config, and deploy config sync. Now the key here is that the POC controller, the Nephew workload controller relies on the cluster objects, right? I mean, when the placement intent is specified, the workload controller passes through all the cluster objects and find the suitable cluster for your deployment. So in this proposal, what I'm saying is the cluster object will be part of the KPD package, and then it will be modified by the by this controller, and then basically it's like wait for the cluster to come up, and then modify this cluster package with the properties of this cluster, and have this cluster object in the workload cluster, so that this cluster is considered by the workload controller while placing the while placing the workloads. And so this part is mainly about the cluster prep dependency controller, which is basically to wait for the clusters to come up and then prepare these clusters for workload orchestration. And the last part here is the resolve cross-cluster dependency. So, I mean, we have to have enough intelligence in the controllers to wait for the packages to come up and to basically come at least to the ready state or running state before we actually update the cluster object and mark this cluster as ready for orchestration. So for this, there is a thread which is going on, a bug. So I have put the number 3543 here in the document. So in this, there is a suggestion to basically rely on the metric pipeline itself. And using this metric pipeline, we can send the metrics to the management cluster about the status of the Kubernetes objects itself, which are created via Nephew. And I mean, we can have some agent controller in the workload cluster that will continuously monitor the status of, for example, status of config sync or NFD or the multus, and then it will report back the status to the management cluster. So the management cluster knows that the cluster is provisioned and all the components that are required for the workload orchestration are in up and running state, and only after that it will mark this cluster as ready in the cluster object, and then this cluster is basically considered for the workload orchestration. Yeah, so I just ran through the whole thing, but this is all documented, and yeah, I mean, we can have the discussion on this document, and yeah, and any questions now?
Yeah, this sounds really good. This sounds interesting to me. I think there were a number of questions in there. There's kind of a lot there. That's something. One thing I wanted to mention was that on the last piece, this is in reverse order, there is a piece that Google has that we've worked on internally that we plan to open source, that it's not exactly what you described, where we leverage the metrics pipeline. So two things. One is, or three things. One is dividing between Porch and Nephew. So Porch will provide a landing place for intent status realization. So that's just, did the workload cluster realize the intent that was pushed to it? Did the config sync push to it? It doesn't have any understanding, obviously, of like whether the network function itself is working. And Porch in its initial version here that we're depending on probably won't provide a mechanism to populate that. I talk about, and that I think it's that issue you linked, 3 different possibilities. And the metrics pipeline is my preferred one because it doesn't rely on, it relies on theoretically an existing transport. But that said, I'm not the only one involved here. Others at Google had other ideas. And so they've actually built a service that runs and uses connectivity between the workload clusters and the management cluster to populate that status, and that will be open sourced. Stephen may be able to talk more about exactly when, but it's certainly well before version 1. Like we want it to be part of version 1. That could cover that without us doing additional work in the community. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Like that would be something already covered. And that has to cover both that populating, like, did the thing get realized, but then hopefully it will also cover like some sort of metrics, and we haven't figured out, or maybe they figured it out in that team. I haven't looked closely, but like, well, we haven't figured out across vendors, like how we would aggregate status with like health of a particular network function, or if there's specific network function status that we want, like does UPF have different status than SMF than AUSF or whatever, right? Or not, but some sort of health indicators, and that would get populated up. So anyway, I'm talking too much, but so this looks great to me. The other thing you mentioned, or a couple things. One is I wanted to say something about. One is cluster per cloud managed cloud provider. Just to give some context, the early diagrams for Nefio show that, and the reason they show that, there's 2 reasons really. One is IAM is a lot easier if you run the controller that manages, or it's maybe safer, I should say, like at least in Google Cloud. I don't know about in other clouds. In Google Cloud, we can use something called workload identity, which means we don't have to like be messing around with exporting secrets and service keys and things like that. So that allows us, if we run KCC, the Google Cloud equivalent, in a GKE cluster, then or even just a cluster running on GCP, then we kind of get some things for free. The other is that separating out, there's a lot of CRDs in these cloud management stacks. And just to avoid proliferating thousands and thousands of CRDs in our Nefio management cluster, it might be useful to segregate, because we don't need those cloud management CRDs to live in the Nefio management cluster if they just live in the GitOps, and then they only get pushed to the cloud management server. Then the CRDs themselves actually only need to be installed on that cloud management server. So that would be the other kind of reason why I think that's a good idea, but I think that's not prescriptive. That's more how we would choose to do it for maybe our reference implementation or something. Anyway, I had something else I want to talk. I don't remember what it was, and there are many other hands, so I'll just stop talking.
Okay, we can keep communicating on this document.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so
can I make a few points?
yes, please.
Yeah, whoever's hand is next. Yeah.
I'm sorry, who is it? I'm driving. I don't know who is in the queue, but I
You're next. You're next, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So Sandeep, thanks for the contribution. I just had basically this high-level questions. Is like, because it seems to be kind of assuming that there is this set of kind of plugins that you can use to bootstrap the clusters and stuff. So from a higher perspective, because from telco, when you're talking about, it could be private cloud instances. When you're talking about cell site kind of deployments, they are like, as far as I know, for example, Verizon have their own web scale kind of infrastructure and stuff like that. It's not always hyperscalers, right? So are we making an assumption that there's always this southbound kind of implementations that allow you to manage the cluster, bootstrap the cluster? I mean, there are several use cases you can think about, like the day zero of basically kind of installing the software on the OS, the base OS on this on the bare metal servers, then basically provisioning the cluster software, then having all the CNIs and for all the other resources that the workloads require and stuff. So the many things that are that's happening under the hood, right? To break it down into many use cases. So so I mean, what is the assumption here, right? I mean, when we talk about cluster management and saying that Neptune will kind of handle these things with an expression of a CRD, how much transparency are we assuming in that southbound interface? I mean, this again, assuming that you are doing both private and say basically something that's managed, probably, the hyperscalers are basically managing the edge clouds and so on. But you would probably, I'm assuming that you need a solution that handles both the scenarios, right?
Yeah.
So in my view, Ravi, if I may quickly, we should be implementation agnostic from the CRDs we define. So in other words, this should work on bare metal, this should work on private clusters and stuff like that. So the fact that if we start, I'm mentioning cross-plane as an implementation, we should basically look at the CRDs that Neptune defines, not at that level, it should be a level up, and whether you use cross-plane to implement or whether you use basically cluster API to implement or any other mechanism that to implement, we should define them in such a way that any implementation can be used to do that, right? At least that's my perspective on that matter. And as a result, we should define those CRDs in such a way that we can allow that.
No, my question is that do we assume the transparency of handshakes that happen between Neptune and say an edge site? So I'm assuming that there is some services that are exposed by the edge clouds, by say you are managing like say many tens of thousands of cell sites and you have cloud instance there. Is that a transparent thing, or is it saying that it is very implementation specific for each implementation, like each cloud provider, so to say?
I guess I'll throw my opinion in here. I'm sorry if I'm jumping hands, but the decoupling is super important. The point you raise is super important. And what I want to do is define our CRDs that Neptune needs to consume for, say, fanning out workloads across the clusters as very separate from any CRDs that are used to provision clusters, because I don't know how those clusters are provisioned. Like Wim said, we need to be implementation independent, and that implementation could even be humans over there setting up those clusters. As inefficient as that may be, it's the state of the art in many cases. So I think that the pieces our upper layer cares about need to be consistent regardless of the underlying implementation. So if I understand your question, like, is there a transparent way for those edge clusters to advertise capabilities? Yes, I think Neptune should define ways for those edge clusters to advertise capabilities that our upper layers can then consume on top of that. How the provisioning of those edge clusters happens such that then they can advertise that is sort of independent. So I'm going to stop talking there and we go through hands because we have a whole bunch of hands, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make a point that it's good to kind of highlight or basically articulate the requirements that we're trying to address right from day zero. What is a day zero assumption here? I mean, basically you can do software management, you can do scaling of clusters, you can do many use cases, right? What are the use cases that we are trying to address? That would be a good starting point. And then basically dive into the solutions.
Now, if I may also, or at least my view is, I think Neptune basically is set up to manage the life cycle of infra as well, which means that potentially the CFDs that we define needs to be able to allow for a cluster to scale, right? So, and of course, yeah. So in other words, I think we have to deal with those aspects somehow. And I believe there is two scenarios that we have to cover. From my point of view, there will be clusters that we will create, and where Neptune is the source of truth, if you will, to basically deploy. and we will have a discovery mode of operation where there is already a cluster in place, and we need to understand the capabilities that are there for us to understand what can be done over there.
Yeah.
Or potentially take over the control or something. So there's two different scenarios. Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry.
How do these hands work in Zoom? Like, how do I know who's next?
I think
So-
Jean-Marie is next.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, so there is a couple of comments that I want to make. I don't think we should think on the clusters or the infrastructure advertising capability. We should think intent. So we should work on CRDs that are allowing the workload to express what it needs from the infrastructure, independently from how the infrastructure is realizing it. Whether it's done manually pre-provisioned by humans and then there is a logic that is doing the mapping, or it is completely dynamically created on demand, doesn't matter and shall not affect that intent CRD that is expressing the requirement that the workload is putting on the infrastructure. And this is the number one priority that, in my opinion, that Nefio should work on, defining those CRDs, and then the implementation will be very different whether this is satisfied by a cluster from Google, a cluster from Amazon, a cluster from a bare metal cluster, etc. Doesn't matter, and that's something that
we need. But that makes sense to me. But what I'm not like, there's two models. One is workload makes a demand and then it gets provisioned, and then there's also infrastructure is out there, workload makes a demand and it gets scheduled on existing ones. So in order to do
that's exactly the same. You are just proposing two implementation of the same API, and as seen as a consumer of the API, I should not be able to make the difference.
That's fair. That's fair. But we do, in our implementation, need to be able to, one is we don't necessarily control provisioning, like, so we need to be able to support both of those use cases, I guess. And so that's what that's how I understand we would do it, is through this sort of.
We need to support both of those use cases, and even more, we need to make those two use cases undistinguishable from the API perspective. If we're not making them undistinguishable, we are not making a good enough job.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But in our implementation, we do need to understand what existing clusters are out there, what capacity they have, what capabilities they have, and if we're going to provision new clusters, what the underlying infrastructure.
Yes, but that's the logic. That's the logic of the controllers. That's the logic of the operators, which are, for sure, we want to have reference implementation, but that's not what we want to impose. What is important to impose are the CRD themselves.
Uh-huh. But it basically means that the scenario that we have to go for is that Nefio will be in charge of owning and managing the cluster, whether they start from it from day zero or whether they discover and take over. That's, I think, what you're saying, Jean-Marie, right? So eventually there will be a CRD that somehow is getting in charge of owning the life cycle of that cluster, and whether it did it from day zero or whether it did it from day two, it doesn't matter.
Not so much holding the life cycle of the cluster. It's expressing the requirements of the workload from the cluster. Whether the workload expresses that it needs more capacity from the cluster, does it translate to actually growing the cluster or not, is implementation specific. What matters is that the workload is able to express that now it needs more capacity from the cluster. Does it mean that the cluster is dynamically scaling, or does it just mean that no, the cluster is failing and it's not giving more capacity? Is a matter of implementation.
So I think the point where I'm differing maybe a little bit, or maybe not, but just maybe as a point of refinement. So we do this, like, for example, at GKE, we have something we call autopilot. You can just throw workloads at it, and we manage the nodes for you. Like we scale them up, scale them down. You don't even have to think about it. That's definitely what we want. But we have to define what the categories are. Like CPU, memory, there's capabilities, there's capacity. You say the word capacity, but capacity, there's capacity in CPU, there's capacity in network, there's capacity.
Exactly.
Many different, there's a sort of array of probably hundreds of different types of capacity. And those are the things that's important, I think, we define.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think anything else,
I think
Jean-Marie?
Hassan is next, right? Or...
Yeah, Hassan is next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with everything you're talking about, like as far as intent goes. I'm mapping this discussion a little bit now to Crossplane because I worked with it for a while and I'm more familiar with it. And also back to Ravi's question about how that would work. So Crossplane provides this like extensibility in 2 dimensions, like on the southbound and then the northbound, where it's a framework. You can have different providers. The community provides, for example, 3 Kubernetes providers for AKS, for GKE, and for EKS. And then it is up to the platform team, in this case Nepio, to build a composite resource, or an XRD as Crossplane calls it, which basically instructs Crossplane how to translate this higher level intent to those like CRDs that are delivered by these underlying providers. For instance, in this case, we can say I want a Kubernetes cluster with 3 nodes of size large, whatever we mean by large. And then instruct Crossplane to say, okay, if you're using your AWS provider, this is how it's done. If it's the GKE provider, this is another way it's done, and a third way. And if we're looking at, let's say, an on-prem deployment or a 4th provider, that's where the second extensibility dimension comes in, that someone can write their own provider for Crossplane. And by that, they say, okay, for my managed Kubernetes environment, this is how I implement it. So I think with these 2 extensibility dimensions, then we have a chance to really provide a good definition for that higher level intent in Nepio, whatever we like to see, and then delegate the actual implementation to these Crossplane providers under the hood.
Yeah, I think that's a great model. I think that it's just one model. So Crossplane is sort of a combination of composition and abstraction. So what I mean by that is what you just described, right? You can sort of define your own CRD, and then you can define a way to express that or transform that into lower level CRDs that have different providers. And that's great. There's one little glitch, and maybe I just don't know Crossplane well enough. Maybe this glitch doesn't exist, and that's that that translation and those providers are invariant logic, right? I can't, like, I have to write new code basically, or new declarations or whatever it is to do those translations, and I can't edit them on a sort of individual break. There's no break glass in that. So I think that we want to be careful that we use those techniques when that's the property we want, when we don't want people to be able to make a change. So one of the things we do in this sort of config as data model, which is not incompatible with this or mutually exclusive, these things can go together quite nicely, is this package, what we call packages interface. So the whole package is open. We all understand the Kubernetes APIs or whatever CRs are in that package, and we can just change them as needed. And this is a sort of break glass thing. So when we fan out variants across 100 clusters, if I decide for some reason, either through an automation or through a human, that one particular cluster has to be slightly different, I can just go in and edit those files. And because I understand those APIs, without creating an abstraction on top of that, that then the problem with abstractions is anytime you need to break glass, you end up bubbling up something into the abstraction. You get these leaky abstractions where they have to understand the underlying southbound interfaces at that northbound abstraction. So the idea is to balance these two, and I just want to make that kind of clear that that's why, to me, Crossplane is not complete solution, but I think it's a valuable part of a solution.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's very opinionated. I just made a comment on the chat, but crossplane is a very opinionated way on using Kubernetes, and I believe we should not lock ourselves into that framework, because what you see is that there are a bunch of restrictions around it by the way that they define things, and we should avoid locking ourselves up in that space.
I mean, I think just
So
like
we should. So as Nephew, as a result, I think we should really focus on the intent-based CRDs, and whether you want to use crossplane for it, go ahead and do that. And whether you want to use Cluster API or whether you want to use another framework, you should be able to do that. But we should not be locking ourselves in an opinionated way that someone came up with. We should basically define what do we need, what are the requirements to satisfy the intents, and take it from there.
Yeah, so just to make it clear, right?
I don't disagree. Just maybe two things here. One is going back to the higher level intent. I think for us, it's very good to define what that higher level CRD or CRDs should be. And then we could have a reference implementation that uses or doesn't use it. I think that's the perfect choice for implementation. The second thing is, I guess it would be good to write down some of these scenarios, because I'm personally curious, like what are these cases that we're talking about that we think the opinionated framework would disallow, or the what you mentioned, John, as the cases that cannot be handled. I think it would be great to sort of provide some more insights there for everyone to be able to understand.
I think that's true. I mean, the issue is this is more like from experience, right? In my experience, in our experience with, and not necessarily in telco, but in enterprise, like with platform teams, it's very common for people to start with a very nice abstraction, and then over time that abstraction erodes because this team wants to do this a little differently, that team wants to do that a little differently, and so you have to provide an option here and you have to provide an option there. So I'm not sure. It's more of a defensive strategy against erosion than I have the upfront. Oh, well, this is where it's going to be needed. But we can think about that and try to write it down.
Sure. I know a lot of hands are up. Quick suggestion. Let's start by writing down the principles for these CRDs before we actually get to defining them. I think we're not completely in agreement. What do you guys think?
I have a proposal of a CRD, Tal. Maybe it's nice to go to the details of an example. And I'm not saying it's, and there is other people who had proposals, so I didn't want to jump ahead, but I have a proposal on how we should frame the CRD, because I think we should look at the details, and then it will probably clear out a bit better on what we need and whether it's okay or not okay. And I purely focus on the cluster, not the surroundings, purely the cluster by itself. But yeah, there was other people first who wanted to have a comment, so maybe we should. But I agree, we should look into the details in my view.
Yeah, okay. I would like to continue if that's fine, because I've been raising the hand now for like 20 minutes and I wanted to say something too. And now I guess the discussion has moved a bit to the comments, but I think the first and foremost important thing is we need to think about how deeply is Nephew intertwined with the cluster itself. I'm not talking about the infrastructure, but with the cluster itself. And we've done like some, let's say, ideas on this for our proposal. We come to the conclusion that unfortunately they are pretty deeply intertwined on some things, that these things are not only how to access the cluster, which of course will be important, but it's also, is the cluster ready? Like, is it ready to go? Can we go? But it's also things like CNI, for example. Like we have seen in our case that changing the CNI later on is like a huge pain to do so. And it is interesting for Nephew to know, for example, about this, what CNI is in the cluster. Now all being said, I think this is the first discussion we kind of have to see where we want to make the cut before we go into all this. Should it be a cluster CRD or what the CRD should look like? And I'm 100% with Tal here that there's some things before that we need to build, not to build, but to discuss first before we can offer this? Because I can also now throw in the next proposal if that is our strategy, because we think, for example, that we should have our complete own CRD that contains everything, and then infrastructure providers should just read from it. just to throw this out. But I think the discussion how deeply is Nephew intertwined with clusters themselves is something that should come first.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in. I think it's my turn. I just want to say I agree with it. The Tal and sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. The person just in front of me, Isfa. Anyway, I think we need to scope what Nephew is and what cloud infrastructure provisioning is, and then define the API to reach down and talk to the existing cluster or requesting a new cluster. But below that, it should not be our concern. I've been in projects in 3 companies now where we struggle through the bare metal discovery and provisioning, the cloud infrastructure provisioning, then the what I call the workloads, deployment and lifecycle management. And Nephew, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, I'm not, the expert here, should be the workload, deployment and lifecycle phase with API reaching into the cloud infra provisioning phase to request capacity, workload, clusters and things like that. Does that make sense? I'm trying to define 3 phases and then place Nephew in one of those boxes or sandboxes, and then define the API to the other sandbox. Architecturally speaking. Does that make sense or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment. I think that we don't want to define a way to do everything about a cluster, right? We want to provide those integration points between our different controllers and understand what each of those controllers demands knowledge about a cluster. So for the workload distribution, workload fan out, we need to know that clusters exist and we need to know how to put workloads on them, and we might need to know some information demographically about the cluster, like what CNIs it supports, so we can determine whether a workload can run on it or not. For other things, we may have other, maybe there's a cost optimization component that needs to understand that the expense of that cluster is different than the expense of that cluster, and that works on work placement as well. So, I mean, I think there'll be different pieces of our platform over time, and we need to understand, those interaction points between them, but we don't want to go deep into like knowing how to provision clusters on every single provider or other environment. We want to rely on upstream projects that already do that.
Yeah, I agree.
So one question just to add to Adam's point. Just seeking a bit of clarity here. We will always term Nephew as more of a domain controller, which is being orchestrated by a higher level components, where Nephew is mainly responsible for orchestrating and then configuration management of CNFs and are the main goals, and in future maybe other things such as closed loop automation through telemetry. Given that it's a domain controller which is being controlled by higher level components in a bigger picture of OSS BSS picture, I'm trying to understand the workflow, whether the cluster creation itself, do you think that will be the responsibility of Nephew, or do you think that should be the responsibility of the component that is controlling Nephew on the north side? It's not an opinion, it's more of a question.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed that.
If I may, if we are doing our implementation correctly, the answer to that question shall not matter. Because I still don't see why whether the nephew is creating the cluster or whether the cluster is creating by other people and assigned to a nephew request, does affect the requirements and the intent that needs to be expressed by the workloads using the cluster.
Okay.
Yeah, but at some point somebody needs to register that cluster to Nefio in order to be able to manage it. Right?
Yes,
so,
and that's the implementation underneath the API. It doesn't affect the API, and the API is what matters.
Yes.
I just read a comment.
I'm talking about, my question is, sorry if I thank you so much for your comment, John. So John, you're trying to answer, then you wanted clarification. My question is,
Então fazemos daqui a nada, então. Sim.
Yeah, my question is, where should be the boundary lines in terms of architecture and separation of concerns and responsibilities lie? From a bigger picture, do we want Nefio to create a cluster? If the answer is yes, absolutely fine, but that's what I'm trying to understand. Or if Nefio being a domain controller, do you think the components that is controlling Nefio on the north side, they'll be responsible?
Yeah, no, I think that, well, one, it probably should work in either case, right? You could, that would be an architectural decision by the people deploying Nefio. But I think that if you look at Nefio's charter, it's infrastructure, workload configuration, and in a relationship between them. So we do want to be able to have an intent that creates clusters. Ultimately, then there's a question of like, over time, right? What is there's the ultimate high level intent is, I want a network that supports this many users with this geographical distribution, and walk away and the whole thing figures it out. Now that's not something we're going to do anytime soon, but like that requires those three areas, right? So I don't know. In my mind, it's within scope. Infrastructure management is absolutely within scope. That's our sort of swim lane one. And then swim lane two, workloads on top of that infrastructure. Now, something higher level might control and say, make the decision, we want to create 20 clusters and can use Nefio to actuate that, or can use a different way to actuate that and then register them with Nefio. I mean, Nefio needs to be open enough to support all those.
Okay, thanks. So both the use cases are valid. Either somebody creates a cluster and registers with it, or asks Nefio to create it. It's both the use cases we need to support. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and what I expect is like for instance, if I provision in the cloud management case, it's easier, right? If I provision 20 clusters in Google Cloud, I can have a controller running in Nefio that reads the Google Cloud APIs and populates Nefio so Nefio knows about them. Like, so I can provision those out of band. By out of band, I mean outside of Nefio, and but still have Nefio automatically see them. But yeah, I think both those.
If I may jump in, in ORAN, in ORAN, they have the concept of resource pool, composable resource pool. So when you create cluster for Nefio, you register it to, in what John said, if I understand him correctly, a controller which control those resource pool. And then when Nefio need a cluster, it talks to that controller and say, I want these intent, these cluster with these intent, these requirements. And that should be, I believe, the boundary of the API, the scope. We don't go in and say, GKE or AWS, AKS, EKS, create these cluster for us. I mean, we assume the pools of resources will be there. Is that a valid approach?
I think it would be mixed on, because in some cases, the resources would be there and we do have to discover them. So it's something a lot of people here emphasize, that it's both. But I want to remind us of another aspect, we actually don't deploy network functions in themselves. There's a higher level network service management going on, right? So the network service management takes it all into account, has to, right? So it takes the network functions that it needs to deploy. It might be just one network function, right? But let's assume that there's something managing that. So it takes into the account the requirements of the network function. Are the requirements met? Well, they might already exist as resources, or they might be resources that need to be deployed. This is usual orchestration stuff, right? This is not, we're not inventing that here. But again, I think we should focus, what we're trying to show is express the requirements that the network function has and find a way to provide them. But we're not going to be installing the clusters. We're not going to be discovering the clusters. There are already systems that do that. We're not trying to invent a new kind of cluster management here. But our responsibility will be to interact with that, because our goal is to deliver that network function. So whether that cluster exists already or will have to be provisions, something will provision it for us. We have to have a way to know when it's provisions, and then it's our turn to actually do that kind of deployment and connectivity there. So,
well,
yeah,
that's on the middle swim lane, but
it
is definitely in the charter that we provision infrastructure, right? Like, I mean, if you go back to the charter, like there's three, go back to the first slide deck, there's 3 swim lanes we show. One is infrastructure, one is workload, and one is workload configuration. And when we just think network function, that's just the middle one, right? And from, I think from the vendors participating, the vendors I've talked to are like, they really want that first swim lane, because a lot of the complexity for them is that they have to deal with different cloud providers and different, like, so.
Well, what I mean, it's not, we don't have to write the code that does that, right? We can interact with the system that's there, right? So if you look at my comment, I talk about these bridge operators that would do that kind of interaction. So we'd have a cross-plane bridge operator, a Red Hat ACM bridge operator, or whatever it is. The thing is that these different solutions have such different paradigms and ways of working, right? We're not going to be able to define a CR that, you know, as you said earlier, John, the abstractions, if you create an abstraction that's the lowest common denominator for everything, that's exactly what the cluster API SIG tried to do. And I think it had mixed success, right? And we're definitely not going to try to create another cluster API, right? So our goal, again, I think, is to keep our eye on the ball with network functions.
May I comment? May I comment? I think there is new initiative. If you look to the gateway API, let's say CRD definition, they allow for a simple set of parameters, but have vendor-specific implementations. And so it basically towards the class model that John has been using a bit in the UPF. So you could use a principle like that to basically satisfy everyone on the planet, because it's the parameter specific things that are needed for a specific implementation, they are decoupled. So by doing something like that, you could satisfy many different options.
Yeah,
and that's just a proposal.
And that's similar to bridge provider would provide that. Jean Marie has his hand up now. The rest of us are just being static.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I sound like a broken record, but I think we're taking the problem from the wrong direction. If we're taking that we need to expose implementation capabilities, we will fall in the same trap than other attempts have been falling into, and we will either just have the lowest common denominator, or we'll have an empty common denominator with extension. We need to take it from the other way, from the consumer perspective. I don't care how you create your cluster or you manage your cluster. That's not my problem. My problem as an application is I don't even care about a cluster. I want a namespace, for instance. So maybe it's not even the cluster that is the right abstraction from our perspective. Maybe that's just the namespace.
Yeah, so I have to agree with you, but we're almost out of time. We have one more hand. I agree with you, but we also have to implement things. So there's a little bit of a tension there. But Ravi, quickly, if you can say something, and then I think we better wrap up because we're out of time.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to say. I mean, I think I agree with. I think it was Vish who made this comment that you have to understand the requirements from the northbound also, because there are other OSS BS systems interacting with it. What are the assumptions when Nephew kind of interacts with that? And then, of course, in the southbound, what the assumptions are.
So I think that's where I was trying to comment. I agree with Charles that scope has to be clearly defined. Yeah. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
that was Bala, not me. This is me.
Bala, sorry, Bala. Yeah.
No worries, no worries. I will take the credit.
It's okay. That's a good point.
Okay, this is a great discussion, but yeah, I think we probably need, yeah, well, I think we should work both angles personally, the principles angle, but we also should keep the ball rolling forward. I fear getting caught up in decision inaction by indecision. So we have something, a principle here at Google we follow called bias toward action, and so I think we should follow both paths. That's my opinion. I owe some documents to this group, but also anybody's also welcome to start up principles and we can start discussing it. But we're out of time here, so thank you all. Have a great new year. We have no more meetings this year. I will not be here for the first meeting of next year, so I don't know if the TSC will meet and we'll have a new vice chair by then. But if not, Tal, will you be here to run that meeting?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, then that will be the plan for that. And have a great, happy New Year, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy holidays, everybody. See you guys all in the new year.
Happy holidays.
Thanks
very much.
Happy New Year and Merry Holidays.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Joyeux Noël.
Merci.
De rien. Now it's time to practice our different spoken languages.
Indeed.
Exactly.
You're gonna say "Gong Hei Fa Cai soon."
Oh yes, I. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Ronnie, good morning. Do you know if this is the right link or like